Elias Thorne was 40 years old, though the deep lines around his mouth and the gray threading through his dark beard made him look much older. He stood perfectly still on that porch, terrifyingly still. It was a stillness he had learned in the muddy fields of Virginia during the war, a stillness he had perfected in the high deserts of the territories. It was the stillness of a predator waiting for movement, or perhaps the stillness of a man terrified that if he moved, he might shatter into 1,000 pieces. He held a mug of coffee that had gone cold in his hand. His lips moved silently, counting. In 2, 3, 4. Hold 2, 3, 4. Out 2, 3, 4. It was a habit from the war, a way to slow the heart before the trigger break. Now, 15 years after the surrender at Appomattox, he used it simply to keep the silence from drowning him. You see, Elias had been a sharpshooter for the Union Army, not just any sharpshooter. He had possessed what his commanding officers called a terrifying gift. He could gauge windage and bullet drop with mathematical precision. He could track the erratic movements of living men through a rifle scope and end them from distances that seemed impossible. After the war, he had drifted west. He served as a scout for the Army for a while. But eventually he realized that the uniform had changed, but the orders remained the same. Kill who we tell you to kill. Do not ask why. So he had done something that most people considered insane. He had bought a mountain. It was a messy business. He sank every dollar he had saved into a patch of earth that no sane person wanted. A derelict mining claim purchased from a prospector who had coughed his lungs out in a Denver flophouse. A government land filing that relied on a surveyor's error from 10 years prior. The deeds were stamped and signed, locked away in a tin box under his floorboards. On paper, Elias Thorne owned the high meadow. He owned the stream that cut through the granite. He owned the shadowed peaks that loomed above. But to the people of Argent Creek, the mining town festering in the valley floor 3,000 feet below, he owned nothing. To them, land belonged to the man with the strength to hold it, or the heritage to claim it. Elias Thorne was a stranger, a Yankee ghost who had bought the Skeeties. The cabin he had built was tight and small, lodgepole pine chinked with mud and moss. It smelled of wood smoke and cured tobacco in solitude. Every night he lit the kerosene lamp and watched the yellow light push back the shadows that always seemed to gather in the corners. His routine was his religion. Survival required it. If he stopped moving, the memories would catch up. So he checked the stove and added a split log of seasoned aspen. He checked the water bucket. He checked the door bar, dropping the heavy oak plank into its iron brackets. He sat at the rough-hewn table and cleaned his rifle. It was a Sharps, a heavy single-shot buffalo gun that could drop a man at a mile if the shooter knew the wind. Elias knew the wind. He disassembled the breech block with blind familiarity, wiping down the metal with an oily rag. He did not like this gun. He respected it the way one respects a rattlesnake or a storm, but he did not love it. It was a tool that had defined his worth to other men for 2 decades. "Good shot, Thorne," the officers would say. They would clap him on the shoulder while looking at the distant gray smudge of a Confederate officer falling from his saddle. They never saw the face of the man falling. Through his scope, Elias always saw the face. He reassembled the rifle and set it on the rack. He ate a dinner of boiled potatoes and salt pork, eating mechanically, tasting nothing. The silence of the mountain was heavy tonight. Usually it was a comfort, a blanket that muffled the screaming noise of the past. But tonight it felt thin, restless. Elias blew out the lamp and lay in the dark with his eyes open. He counted breaths until the rhythm pulled him down into a sleep that was black and dreamless. He did not know it yet, but everything was about to change. Because 3,000 feet below in the mud and greed of Argent Creek, a powerful man was staring up at his mountain. A man who believed that land belonged to whoever had the strength to take it. And that man had decided that Elias Thorne had hidden away long enough. The war was coming. Not the kind fought with armies and flags, but the kind fought with whispers and threats and midnight fires. The kind that turns neighbors into enemies and strangers into allies. The kind that would force Elias to choose between the man he had been and the man he wanted to become. But I am getting ahead of myself. First, let me tell you about the town and the monster who ruled it. Argent Creek was not a town built on hope. It was built on greed and mud. The main street was a trench of slurry that froze hard in the morning and turned to soup by noon. False front buildings lined the rutted thoroughfare, their paint peeling before it even dried. Saloons and a general mercantile, and an assay office that smelled of chemicals and desperation. The town existed for one reason only, the silver mine that chewed into the valley walls. A gaping wound in the mountain owned by a man named Leland Holloway. Now pay attention, because this is important. Holloway did not just own the mine, he owned the bank that lent money to the miners. He owned the company store where they spent their wages. He owned the boarding houses where they slept. And effectively, he owned the law. The sheriff was a thick-necked man named Vance who walked a line as crooked as the creek itself. He kept just enough order to ensure the silver kept moving, but never enough order to threaten Holloway's profits. In a town like that, rumors spread faster than fire. And the rumors about Elias Thorne had started the very week he filed his claim. "He is a killer," a miner whispered over a glass of rot-gut whiskey at the Bucket of Blood saloon. "Look at his eyes, flat as a reptile. That is a man who has killed more than his share." "He is hiding something up there," another muttered, wiping coal dust from his forehead. "No man buys a peak where the snow stays until July unless there is gold he does not want to share." "I heard he was a deserter," a third man lied, eager to feel important. "Ran from the cavalry after butchering a village. That is why he lives where the law cannot climb." The stories grew with every telling. In the minds of the townspeople, Elias was not a solitary man seeking peace. He was a dragon guarding a horde, a warlock, a fugitive. He was the other, the vessel into which they poured all their frustrations and all their greed. If the mine laid off men, it was because the best silver was up on Thorne's mountain. If a child fell ill, it was the bad air blowing down from his peak. Elias knew the whispers. He felt them whenever he rode into town. Heavy stares prickling the back of his neck like hot needles. But he did not care what they said. He had bought the mountain to get away from people. Their opinions meant nothing to him. What he did not understand was that Leland Holloway was listening to those whispers too. And Holloway was a man who knew how to use hatred like a tool. The mine owner was 60 years old, with a face like carved granite and eyes that had the warmth of frozen creek water. He wore suits that cost more than most miners earned in a year. He spoke softly because men with real power never need to shout. And he had a foreman named Boyd Calloway who did his dirty work. Calloway was the opposite of his employer. Where Holloway was cold, Calloway was hot. Where Holloway calculated, Calloway bullied. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and vain, with a coat that had a fur collar and a smile that revealed teeth too small for his jaw. One evening in late autumn, these two men sat in the back booth of the Golden Nugget Saloon. The booth had maroon velvet curtains that could be drawn for privacy. They were drawn now. "The surveyor says there is a vein," Holloway said quietly. He traced his finger along a map spread out on the table. "It runs northwest from our current shaft, right under that hermit's meadow." Calloway leaned forward. "So we buy him out. I sent a man last month." Holloway's voice was flat. Thorne would not even discuss terms. Said his land was not for sale at any price. "Everyone has a price, not this one." Holloway folded the map carefully. "He is a war veteran, a Yankee sniper with a head full of ghosts. Men like that do not respond to money. They respond to pressure." Calloway smiled, that smile that never reached his eyes. "What kind of pressure?" "The quiet kind." At first, Holloway sipped his whiskey. "Cut his fence, kill his stock, make him feel hunted." "Men who live alone are fragile, Calloway. They depend on routine. Disrupt the routine, and they start to crack. And if he does not crack," Holloway set down his glass, "then we help him have an accident, a man alone on a mountain, no witnesses, no questions. It happens all the time in country like this." Calloway nodded slowly. "And if he shoots back?" "That," Holloway said softly, "would be even better. If he fires first, we have justification. We ride up there with the sheriff and a posse. We hang him legal-like, and then we file a claim on abandoned property." The two men looked at each other in the dim light of the kerosene lamp. A silent agreement passed between them, the kind of agreement that honest men never make. The hermit on the mountain had no idea what was coming. And 3,000 feet above, Elias Thorne cleaned his rifle and stared into the fire and counted his breaths. In 234, hold 2, 3, 4, Out 2, 3, 4, the piece he had built was about to shatter, but not in the way anyone expected, because a storm was coming, the kind made of wind and snow and ice, and that storm was going to deliver something to his doorstep that would change everything. Not a threat, a woman, and with her, a war that would force him to become the very thing he had climbed a mountain to escape. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks after the first heavy snow. Elias was patrolling the perimeter of the lower meadow. It was a bowl of yellow grass that he had fenced with cedar posts and 3 strands of barbed wire to keep his 2-pack mules and single milk cow from wandering off a cliff. He stopped at the southern corner where the game trail rose up from the valley. The wire was cut. It had not snapped from the cold. The ends were bright and sheared clean. Someone had used cutters. Elias knelt in the snow. He touched the severed wire with his bare fingers. He looked at the ground. Boot tracks. 2 men. They had come up the trail, cut the fence, walked 10 yards inside, and then turned back. But they had left something. 20 feet inside the fence line, a mule deer doe lay dead in the snow. She had been shot through the gut. A sloppy, cruel shot that would have taken hours to kill her. But they had not taken the meat. They had not taken the hide. They had butchered the hindquarters, hacking the flesh into useless muddy strips and leaving the rest to rot. Elias stood up slowly. This was not hunting. This was waste. This was a message. We can come here. We can take what is yours. We can kill what we want. He felt something bloom in his chest, a cold heat, an old, familiar sensation he had spent 15 years trying to drown. It was the feeling of the hunt. He did not shout. He did not fire his rifle into the air. He walked back to the cabin, retrieved a coil of wire and his tools, and repaired the fence. He worked methodically, twisting the steel barbs tight, his hands bare and immune to the cold. He dragged the carcass deep into the timber for the wolves. He buried the blood with fresh snow. He fixed the boundary. But as he looked down the slope toward the smoke of Argent Creek, he knew the fence was no longer just a fence. It was a trigger. 2 days later, he needed supplies. The flour barrel had run low. He saddled the gray mule, a sour-tempered beast named Solomon, and began the long descent. The trail was treacherous, a series of switchbacks carved into the scree that required absolute attention. One wrong step and the mule would slide, taking rider and cargo down 1,000 feet of loose rock. As he descended, the air grew thicker, richer, filled with the smells of wet earth and coal smoke. The silence of the peaks faded, replaced by the distant clang of the stamp mill and the barking of dogs. He rode into Argent Creek at noon. The town was busy. Wagons churned through the mud. The boardwalks were crowded with men in canvas coats. But conversation died as Elias rode past. Silence rippled down the street like a wave. Men stopped mid-sentence, turning to watch the mountain man. The Yankee hermit. Elias kept his eyes forward. He tied Solomon to the rail outside Miller's Mercantile and stepped inside. The store was warm, smelling of coffee beans and dry goods. Miller, the shopkeeper, was a nervous man who wiped his hands constantly on a stained apron. He looked up as the bell jingled, his smile faltering when he saw who it was. "Mr. Thorne," Miller said. His voice was tight. "Mr. Miller." Elias's voice was gravel, unused to shaping words. "I need a sack of flour, 5 pounds of coffee, a tin of lard, and a box of 4570 cartridges." Miller hesitated. He glanced toward the back of the store. 3 men were leaning against the counter there. One of them straightened up. It was Boyd Calloway. The foreman was dressed in his expensive coat with the fur collar. He had a face that was handsome until he smiled, revealing those small teeth. "Well now," Calloway said, stepping forward. "The king of the hill comes down to mingle with the peasants." Elias ignored him. He placed $2 on the counter. "The flour, Miller." Calloway moved closer. He invaded Elias's space. He smelled of bay rum and stale cigar smoke. "We heard you had some trouble up there, Thorne. Found a cut fence, did you?" Elias turned his head slowly. He looked at Calloway. He did not glare. He simply looked, observing the man the way he would observe a shifting wind or a loose rock. He noted the pistol on Calloway's hip, the way the man's weight was shifted to his left foot, the arrogance in his eyes. "I fixed it," Elias said softly. Calloway laughed, a sharp barking sound. "Fixed it? A fence is just wire, Yankee." "Wire snaps. Things get through. Maybe next time it is not a deer that gets gutted. The threat hung in the air, heavy and wet. Elias felt the counting start in his head. In 2, 3, 4, he could kill Calloway. The thought was not emotional, it was geometric. A sweeping strike to the throat. A pivot. The knife from his belt. It would take 3 seconds. The shame of the thought followed instantly. Hot and bitter. This was why he had bought the mountain. To stop thinking like a weapon. If you want to talk about fencing, Elias said, his voice steady, you come up and talk. But if I find another animal wasted on my land, I will not be the one repairing things. He turned back to Miller. My goods. Miller scrambled to fill the order. His hands shook as he weighed the flour. Elias took the supplies. He slung the heavy sack over his shoulder and walked out. Watch your back, soldier, Calloway called after him. The mountain is a lonely place to die. Elias untied the mule and mounted. He did not look back. He rode out of town with the mud sucking at the mule's hooves and the laughter of the men fading behind him. The climb back up was grueling. By the time he reached the tree line, the sun was gone and the temperature had plummeted. He unloaded the mule and stabled the animals. He chopped wood until his shoulders burned, the axe biting deep into the pine. Then he stood on the porch, looking down at the lights of Argent Creek. They flickered like distant embers in a fire pit. He was safe here. The elevation was a fortress. The cold was a moat. But standing there, listening to the wind hiss through the needles of the stunted spruce, Elias felt the crushing weight of a truth he had been avoiding. He was safe, and he was entirely, devastatingly alone. He had bought the silence to escape the noise of humanity, but silence has a voice of its own. It whispered that he was broken. It whispered that he did not deserve to be around people. It whispered that his only talent was ending things. He went inside and barred the door. 3 days later, the weather turned. It began in the morning as a purple bruise on the northern horizon. By noon, the sky was a sheet of iron. By 2 in the afternoon, the mountain was gone. The storm hit with the violence of a hammer. It was a whiteout, a blizzard of such intensity that it erased the world. The wind screamed like a living thing, tearing at the shingles of the cabin, searching for any crack to let the cold in. Elias sat by the stove, feeding it wood. The temperature inside the cabin dropped despite the fire. Frost began to form on the inside of the nail heads in the walls. He drank coffee and tried to read a tattered geological survey, trying to ignore the howling outside. In 2, 3, 4. The wind gusted. The heavy timbers of the roof groaned. Elias looked up. He thought he heard something. A sound that was not wind. A thump. He waited. Another thump, softer this time. Like a sack of grain dropped against the logs. He stood up and put his hand on the Navy revolver tucked into his belt. Bears were sleeping this time of year. But desperation woke beasts up. Or perhaps it was Calloway's men, foolish enough to try and burn him out in a storm. He moved to the door. He listened. A scratch. A low, whimpering sound. It was not a bear. It was not a man trying to break in. It was the sound of something dying. Elias lifted the heavy bar. The wind pressed against the door, trying to hold it shut, then trying to rip it from his grasp. He shoved it open. The world was a swirling vortex of white. The snow was flying horizontal, stinging his face like birdshot. He squinted, shielding his eyes with his arm. "Hello?" he shouted. His voice was snatched away instantly. He looked down. There, crumpled at the edge of the porch, half buried in a drift that was accumulating by the second, was a shape. It was wrapped in layers of frozen stiff fabric. Elias dropped to his knees. He grabbed the bundle. It was heavy, dead weight. He felt a shoulder, an arm. He pulled. The figure slid across the rough planks. He dragged it over the threshold and kicked the door shut, throwing his weight against it to latch it against the gale. The silence of the room rushed back in, broken only by the roar of the fire and the whistle of the wind in the chimney. Elias knelt beside the figure. The clothes were dark wool, soaked through and frozen stiff. A coat that was too big, a scarf wrapped tight around the head. He pulled the scarf away. It was a woman. Her face was pale as the snow outside. Her lips were blue. Her eyelashes were frosted with ice. She had dark hair plastered to her skull, and there was a bruise on her cheekbone, dark and ugly, blooming like spilled ink. She was not moving. She was barely breathing. Elias stared at her. He had expected poachers. He had expected wolves. He had not expected this. He reached out, his hand hovering over her face. He was afraid to touch her, afraid that the warmth of his hand might be a shock that killed her, or that she was already gone and he would be touching only a shell. But then she gasped, a ragged, shallow sound that rattled in her chest. Elias Thorne, the man who had bought a mountain to escape the world, looked at the woman bleeding onto his floor. The storm howled outside, finishing what the people below had started. But here, in the circle of lamplight, the war had just changed. He moved his hand and touched her neck. Searching for a pulse, it was there, faint, fluttering, a bird trapped in a cage. "You are a fool," he whispered, to her, or perhaps to himself. He began to unbutton her frozen coat. The isolation was over. The siege had begun. The layers of wool and cotton were stiff with ice, molded to her body like a second freezing skin. Elias worked by the light of the kerosene lamp. His breath plumed in the cold air of the cabin before the stove could fully beat back the chill. He had dragged her to the hearth, laying her on the braided rug. He stood over her with a knife in his hand, and he hesitated. The blade was sharp, familiar, a tool he had used to dress game and whittle triggers. But holding it this close to a human throat made his pulse hammer in his ears. In 234, he knelt. He had to get the wet clothes off her, or the hypothermia would kill her before the fire ever warmed her blood. It was a medical necessity, that was what he told himself. But as he sliced through the sodden laces of her boots and peeled away the frozen canvas coat, his hand shook. Not from cold, but from a terrifying intimacy he had not known in 20 years. He was a man who had spent 2 decades making sure no one touched him, and that he touched no one. Contact meant conflict. Contact meant a knife in the ribs or a hand on a wound. Now he was forced to navigate the geography of a stranger's body. He cut away the coat. Beneath it was a man's flannel shirt, oversized and saturated. He unbuttoned it with clumsy, numb fingers, his eyes fixed resolutely on the fabric. When he peeled the shirt away, the bruising stopped him. Her ribs were a map of violence. Dark purple and sickly yellow splotches bloomed across her side, the distinct mark of a boot toe, the grazing impact of a fall, or perhaps a fist. She had not just been running from the storm, she had been running from a beating. Elias felt a surge of nausea. He swallowed it down. He worked quickly now, stripping the last of the wet garments away with grim clinical efficiency. He grabbed the heavy quilt from his bunk and wrapped her in it, tucking the edges tight until she was nothing but a cocoon of dry warmth. He lifted her. She was frighteningly light, bird-boned and hollowed out by hunger. He placed her in his bed. Then he sat in the rocking chair by the stove, the knife still in his hand, and watched her chest rise and fall. The storm outside bettered the walls, 1,000 weeping ghosts trying to get in. But the silence inside was louder. It was the silence of a man who had let the world back in and was waiting for the punishment to follow. She woke 14 hours later. Elias was outside chopping wood. The rhythm of the axe was his clock. Swing, crack, breath, swing, crack, breath. When he came inside, shaking the snow from his shoulders, he saw her sitting up in the bunk. She had found his Navy revolver. She held it with both hands. The heavy barrel wavered slightly, but it was pointed directly at his chest. Her eyes were dark, almost black, wide with the feral panic of a cornered animal. She looked to be in her mid-20s, though the terror in her face made her look younger, and the exhaustion made her look ancient. "Put it down," Elias said. His voice was rust. He had not used it in 3 days. "Stay back," she croaked. Her voice was cracked, dry as old parchment. "I will shoot." Elias did not move. He stood by the door with the cold draft swirling around his boots. "That is a single action," he said calmly. "You have to cock the hammer first." She looked down at the gun, realized he was right. Her thumb fumbled for the hammer, but her hands were shaking too badly. The heavy spring defeated her weak grip. She let out a frustrated sob but did not lower the weapon. "You were freezing," Elias said. He kept his hands open and visible. "You fell on my porch. I brought you inside. I did not hurt you. You undressed me." It was an accusation, sharp and humiliated. "Wet clothes kill you in this weather." "I wrapped you up. I sat in that chair all night." He gestured to the rocker. I have not touched you since. She stared at him, searching for the lie. She had a face that mixed the sharp, angular planes of the high desert tribes with the lighter complexion of the men who had come to conquer them. It was a striking face, intelligent and wary. She looked at the stove, the boiling coffee pot, the neat stack of firewood. Then she looked back at him, at his graying beard and the scar that ran through his left eyebrow. Slowly the barrel of the gun lowered. She did not let go of it, but she let it rest on the quilt. Where am I, she asked. High country, above Argent, the mining town. She shivered, and it was not from the cold. How far? 3,000 feet up. 5 miles of bad trail. They will not come up here. She whispered it more to herself than to him. Who? She clamped her mouth shut. The trust was gone as quickly as it had appeared. No one. I got lost. You got lost with broken ribs and a bruised face? Elias walked to the stove and poured a tin cup of coffee. He set it on the table, well out of her reach, forcing her to choose whether to stay in the bed or move. I do not care who you are running from, he said, but do not lie to me. The snow is 6 feet deep outside. You are stuck here until it clears. Lies take up too much room in a cabin this small. She watched him. He saw her calculating the distance, the risk. Finally, she swung her legs out of the bunk. She was wearing one of his spare wool shirts, which hung on her like a master's robe. She wrapped the quilt around her shoulders and moved to the table. She drank the coffee black, holding the cup with both hands, closing her eyes as the heat hit her stomach. Clara, she said after a long silence. My name is Clara. Elias. Thank you, Elias. Drink your coffee. He turned his back to her to attend the fire. We have a long winter. The days that followed were a study in uneasy coexistence. The cabin was a small vessel on a vast frozen ocean, and they were two castaways circling each other. Elias set the boundaries early. You sleep in the bunk, I sleep on the floor by the hearth. You do not touch the rifles. You do not go outside the fence line until you can walk a mile without wheezing. You do not ask me about the war. And what are your rules for yourself? Clara asked one evening. She was watching him oil his boots. I keep you alive. Elias did not look up. That is the only rule that matters. Clara was a puzzle to him. She was clearly educated. On the third day, he found her reading the copy of Paradise Lost he kept on the shelf. Her lips moved silently as she parsed the dense verse. She knew how to mend clothing with a skill that shamed his own clumsy stitching. She knew which herbs in his pantry would help a fever and which were for flavoring meat. Her heritage was written in her features and her accent, a blending of worlds. She told him in fragments. A father who was a surveyor from Ohio, a mother from a family in Santa Fe with roots that went back to the Spanish land grants. She spoke of being too brown for the white schools and too white for the laborers. She had been a governess, a seamstress, a clerk. I am trouble, she said one night. The wind rattled the door as she spoke. That is the word they use. It does not matter what I do. If I walk with my head down, I am plotting. If I walk with my head up, I am proud. If I refuse a man, I am haughty. If I smile, I am loose. She did not tell him exactly who she had run from, but the bruises told the story. A powerful man, a man who did not like to be refused, a man who thought he owned things, land, silver, women. Elias thought of the mine owner Holloway and the foreman Calloway, but he did not press. What confused Clara was Elias's gentleness. She watched him constantly, waiting for the violence she knew men were capable of. She watched his large, scarred hands as he handled the cast-iron skillets or checked the hooves of the mules. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion, never wasting energy, never stumbling. He was a weapon in a dormant state. But when he changed the dressing on her ribs, his touch was lighter than a breath. When he spoke to her, his voice was low and devoid of command. He made her soup from dried venison and potatoes, skimming the fat so it would not settle hard on her stomach. You are not what they say in town, she said one morning. He was shaving by the window, and she watched him in the small mirror. Elias paused. The razor hovered at his throat. What do they say? That you are a monster, that you eat raw meat and shoot men for sport. Elias scraped the razor down his jaw. They are half right. The intimacy of the cabin was suffocating and sweet. There was no privacy. He heard her breathe in her sleep. She heard him grind his teeth when the nightmares came. They learned the rhythm of each other's bodies, how she favored her left side, how he stiffened when the wind howled too loudly, like a screaming shell. One afternoon, the sun broke through. It turned the world into a blinding expanse of diamond dust. Clara was sitting by the window mending a tear in his coat. Elias was cleaning his Sharps rifle. He looked up and caught her watching him. The sun caught the dust motes dancing between them. For a moment, the survival tasks faded. He saw the curve of her neck, the darkness of her eyes, the strength in her hands. He felt a pull, magnetic and terrifying, a desire to cross the room and bury his face in the hollow of her shoulder, to feel warmth that was not from a fire. She saw it too. Her breath hitched. The needle stopped moving. Elias looked down at the rifle. He snapped the breech block shut with a loud clack. "Water is low," he said, roughly. "I need to melt more snow." He went outside without a coat, letting the biting wind freeze the heat out of his blood. The peace broke 10 days later. The snow had packed down, forming a hard crust that could support a man's weight. Elias was in the barn milking the cow when he heard the shout. "Hey, anyone home in the eagle's nest?" Elias dropped the bucket. He moved to the door and peered through the crack. Two men were standing at the lower edge of the meadow. They were not locals. They wore heavy buffalo coats and carried new Winchester repeating rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They were young, laughing, their faces flushed with exertion and arrogance. They had cut the wire again. This time they had not just cut it. They had tied a piece of red flannel to the post, a mockery of a flag. Elias moved. He did not run. He walked to the cabin. Clara was standing by the window. Her face was pale. "Stay inside," Elias said. "And then, they have guns," she whispered. "So do I." He did not take the Sharps. He took the double-barreled shotgun from behind the door. At close range, it was a deterrent that required no translation. He walked out onto the porch and down the path. The snow crunched under his boots. The air was thin and crisp, carrying sound for miles. The two men watched him come. They did not look afraid. They looked like men who had never been told no in a language they understood. "You are trespassing," Elias said when he was 20 yards away. His voice was not loud. It was flat, drained of all inflection. It was the voice of a man reading a supply list. The taller of the two, a man with a thin mustache and eyes that were too close together, grinned. "Trespassing on a mountain? God made the mountain, old man. You just squat on it." "I hold the deed," Elias said. "The fence is the line. You cut my wire." "Wire is cheap," the second man said. He was stockier, chewing on a plug of tobacco. "We heard there was game up here. Big game. Maybe some two-legged deer." He leered at the cabin. Elias felt the counting start. In 2, 3, 4. He looked at the rifles on their shoulders. Winchesters. Fast firing. He had 2 shots in the shotgun. He would have to take the tall one first, then drop to the snow to avoid the second man's return fire. He calculated the angles, he calculated the wind, but he did not raise the gun. "Turn around," Elias said. "Fix the wire on your way out. If you come back, I will not come out to talk." The tall man laughed. He unslung his rifle, holding it loosely in one hand. "You think you can order us? We work for Mr. Holloway. He says this land is open range until the survey proves otherwise. He says you are just a squatter with a heavy trigger finger." "Holloway is not here," Elias said. "I am." The man spat in the snow. "We go where we please, Grandpa. Maybe we will come up and say hello to the lady. Heard she is a warm one." Clara was watching from the window. She saw Elias go still. It was not the stillness of fear. It was the stillness of a statue. The tension left his shoulders. His grip on the shotgun relaxed slightly. To the men, it looked like surrender. To Clara, it looked like death. "Go," Elias said softly. The men laughed again. They turned their backs on him with deliberate disrespect. They walked past him, deeper into the meadow, toward the timberline. They did not fix the fence. Elias did not shoot them in the back. He watched them go. He watched the scourge. The clouds above the peaks were curling, gray tendrils hooking over the granite like fingers. The wind had changed direction 3 minutes ago. The air pressure was dropping so fast his ears popped. He turned and walked back to the cabin. "You let them go?" Clara asked. Her voice trembled with disbelief as he barred the door. "They said they would come back." Elias placed the shotgun on the rack. He went to the stove and added 2 large logs. "They are not coming back." "How do you know?" "Look at the barometer." He pointed to the instrument on the wall. The needle had bottomed out. "And look at their coats, canvas and cotton lining. They are dressed for a walk in the valley, not a climb in the clouds." Clara stared at him. "The mountain does not care if they work for Holloway." Elias looked at her. His eyes were devoid of anger. They were empty. The mountain only cares that they are stupid. The squall hit 20 minutes later. It was not a storm. It was an execution. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in an hour. The wind roared down the canyon walls at 70 miles per hour, blinding, deafening, carrying ice crystals that scoured skin raw. Inside the cabin, the logs groaned under the assault. Clara sat by the fire, shivering despite the heat. She imagined the 2 men out there, in the open, on the scree slopes where there was no shelter, no trees, only the sliding rock and the screaming wind. "Should we?" she started, then stopped. Elias was counting breaths. His eyes were closed. "No, they will die. They chose the ground," Elias said. "I gave them the warning." The storm raged for 6 hours. When it broke, the silence that followed was heavy, like a church after a funeral. 2 days later, a prospector coming up the lower trail found the stocky man. He had made it to the tree line before collapsing. He was frostbitten, missing 3 toes and babbling in a fever delirium. He told the men who carried him down that the mountain had come alive. He said a ghost had walked through the timber, watching them freeze. A gray figure that left no tracks. He said the wind had voices in it. The tall man was never found. The scree slope had shifted under the weight of the new snow, sliding thousands of tons of rock into the ravine. He was part of the mountain now. News traveled fast in Argent Creek. "Thorne killed them," the whispers went. "He did not shoot them. He hexed them. He led them into a trap." He stood there and watched the storm take them. The stocky survivor wept in the saloon, nursing his bandaged feet. He knew it was coming. He looked at the sky and smiled. The legend of Elias Thorne hardened. He was no longer just a hermit. He was a warlock, a demon, a man who commanded the weather. Up in the cabin, the reality was quieter and far more dangerous. Clara stood at the window looking out at the repaired fence. Elias was out there, checking the tension on the wire. She realized then that she was safe. As long as she was behind that wire, behind that man, the world could not touch her. The brutality of the mine owner, the judgment of the town, the shame of her past, none of it could cross that line. But she also saw the way Elias checked the horizon. She saw the new vigilance in his posture. The fence was not just a boundary anymore. It was a challenge. By surviving, by letting the mountain kill his enemies, Elias had humiliated powerful men. And powerful men do not forgive humiliation. Clara touched the cold glass. She had found a sanctuary, but she knew with a sinking heart that she had also brought a war to his doorstep. The fence was turning into a line that the world would try to burn down. And she was the kindling. The winter did not retreat, but Clara did not break. For the first month, she had been a ghost in the cabin, a fragile shape moving between the bunk and the stove, wrapped in layers of wool. But as the bruises on her ribs faded from angry purple to dull yellow, something steel hard emerged from beneath the injury. She began to claim the space. It started with small things. She reorganized the pantry, stacking the tins of lard and sacks of flour in a logic that defied Elias's bachelor chaos. She took the dried sage and rosemary, hanging from the rafters, and crumbled them into jars, filling the room with a scent that cut through the stale odor of wood smoke and gun oil. Elias watched this transformation with a feeling that sat uncomfortably between gratitude and intrusion. He was used to surviving. Clara was interested in living. One morning he returned from checking the lower fence to find the cabin filled with the smell of roasting meat. Clara was at the stove, turning a rabbit in the cast iron skillet. She had found his snares, repaired the frayed wire on 2 of them, and set them along the game trail behind the woodpile. "I used the onions," she said without looking at him as he stomped the snow from his boots, "and the last of the dried apples." The meat was lean. It needed the sugar. Elias hung his coat on the peg. He looked at the rabbit. It was dressed cleanly. The fur was saved and stretched on a small hoop near the heat. I did not know you could have dead at a snare, he said. Hunger teaches fast, Clara replied. She plated the food and set it on the table. And I have tired of eating gruel while you eat like a monk doing penance. They ate in silence, but it was a companionable silence. The food was good, better than good. It had flavor, balance, a touch of care that Elias had not tasted in years. He felt a heat rise in his neck, a sudden sharp embarrassment. He had saved her life. Yes, but she was bringing civilization back to his. He did not know how to thank her without admitting how lonely he had been. The wind is shifting, she said, watching him over the rim of her coffee cup. Elias paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. How do you know? You are rubbing your left knee, she said. You only do that when the pressure drops. Elias lowered his hand slowly. He had not realized he was doing it. It was an old injury from a fall in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a barometer made of bone and cartilage. And you, he countered. His voice was low. You stop breathing when you hear the mule kick the stall wall. Clara stiffened slightly, then forced her shoulders to relax. It sounds like a boot against a door. It is just Solomon, Elias said gently. He hates the cold. I know, Clara whispered. But the body remembers before the mind can explain. They sat there, the fire crackling. Two people mapping the geography of each other's trauma without needing to speak the names of the places where they had been hurt. It was an intimacy sharper than touch. The descent into Argent Creek had become a gauntlet. They needed supplies again. Flour, coffee, medicine for the cough Clara had developed. They rode into town at noon. The silence that greeted them was no longer the silence of curiosity. It was the silence of a held breath before a scream. Women sweeping their boardwalks gathered their skirts and retreated inside, slamming doors with a sharpness that echoed like gunshots. A woman Claire had once exchanged a shy smile with, a baker's wife named Sarah, crossed the street solely to avoid passing them, dragging her child by the arm. As they reached the mercantile, a voice called out behind them. You are looking well for a woman living in a cave? Clara stiffened. She turned to find Boyd Calloway standing 3 feet away. The foreman was leaning against a support post, cleaning his fingernails with a small penknife. Mr. Calloway, Clara said carefully. She kept the mule between them. It must be hard, Calloway said. He stepped around the animal. Up there in the wind. With a man like that, a man with so much history. We are doing fine. Are you? Calloway smiled, that smile that never reached his eyes. Word is the law is looking closely at Mr. Thorne. People go up that mountain and vanish. That makes people nervous. And when people get nervous, they look for someone to blame. He took another step. Clara backed up. Her heel hit the boardwalk. You do not belong up there, Clara. Calloway lowered his voice. The menace was wrapped in false concern. You are a woman of specific talents. We know about Denver. We know about the Russell household. Clara's blood ran cold. I see you remember, Calloway chuckled softly. Mr. Russell was quite vocal about the theft. A diamond brooch, was it not? And a servant girl who vanished the same night. I took nothing, Clara hissed. I left with the clothes on my back. That is not the story the wire service tells, Calloway said. If the sheriff here finds out you are a fugitive thief, he might decide you are not worth protecting. And if Thorne goes down for murder, well, a woman like you will need friends, powerful friends. He reached out and brushed a piece of lint from her sleeve. The gesture was possessive, terrifyingly intimate. Think about it, Calloway said. The mountain is a dangerous place. Accidents happen. The door to the post office opened. Elias stepped out. He saw Calloway. He saw Clara's pale face. He dropped the paper he was holding. Elias did not walk. He blurred. He covered the distance in 2 strides, placing himself between Clara and the foreman. He did not draw his weapon. He simply stood there, radiating a violence so concentrated it felt like heat. Step back, Elias said. Calloway held up his hands. The penknife snapped shut. Just being neighborly, Thorne. Warning the lady about the weather. The weather is fine, Elias said. The air down here is the problem. Calloway laughed. He tipped his hat to Clara. Remember what I said, my dear. Options are like gold veins. They run out. He turned and walked away, whistling. They did not speak until they were halfway up the switchbacks, where the air thinned and the stench of the town was replaced by the clean scent of pine resin. Clara rode with her head down, her shoulders hunched. When they reached the cabin, she slid off the mule and went straight inside. Elias stabled the animals, his movements mechanical. He could still see the fear in her eyes. It was not the fear of a storm or a bear. It was the fear of a trap closing. When he entered the cabin, Clara was sitting at the table. Her hands were clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. "He knows," she whispered. Elias hung his coat on the peg. "He knows what?" "Denver." She looked up at him. The shame in her face broke his heart. "He knows about the Russell family. He called me a thief." Elias sat across from her. "Tell me." "I was a maid," Clara said. Her voice trembled. "For a wealthy family. Mr. Russell, he had a wandering eye. He would corner me in the pantry, the linen closet. I said no. I kept saying no." She took a ragged breath. "One night he did not ask. He came to my room. I fought him. I hit him with a heavy brass candlestick. He fell, and I ran." She looked at her hands. "I did not pack. I did not take my wages. I just ran." The next day he reported a diamond brooch missing. He told the police I had seduced him, robbed him, and fled. A warrant was issued. I had to keep moving. I changed my name. I worked in kitchens, anywhere they paid cash and did not ask questions. Her voice cracked. But the story followed me. A woman alone, running. Everyone assumes the worst. He lied to cover his own sin, Elias said. The anger in his chest was a cold, hard knot. "It does not matter if he lied," Clara cried out. "He is rich. He is a pillar of society. I am nobody. In the eyes of the law, I am a thief. And Calloway, he will use that. He will tell the town. They will come for me. Let them come. You cannot fight the whole world, Elias. I can fight the part of it that tries to touch you." "And then what?" Clara stood up, pacing the small room. "Then you are a murderer and I am the cause. I am a trap, Elias. Everywhere I go, trouble follows. I should leave. I should go over the past tonight." "Sit down," Elias commanded. It was the voice of the sergeant, absolute and unyielding. Clara stopped. She looked at him. "You are not a trap," Elias said. His voice softened. "You are a survivor, and you are not leaving." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening tree line. "You think you are the only one with a ghost?" He turned back to face her. The shadows obscured his eyes, but his voice was stripped bare. "They call me a sniper, a marksman." He paused. "In the war, my job was not to fight. It was to murder. I lay in the mud for days, waiting for a man to shave, or eat, or read a letter from his wife. And when he was happy, when he was human, I ended him." Clara watched him, her own fear suspended by his confession. "I told myself it was for the Union," Elias said. "I told myself it saved lives. But the truth is that after the first few, I stopped feeling it. I stopped seeing them as men. They were just windage and elevation. I became a machine." His voice cracked. "That is my shame, Clara. Not that I killed, but that I was so good at it that I slept soundly afterwards." He walked over to her. He reached out and took her hands. His palms were rough, calloused, warm. "Calloway tries to use your past to shame you. He tries to use my past to scare me, but he forgets one thing." "What?" Clara whispered. "We are not those people anymore." He pulled her closer. The air in the cabin shifted. The fear that had been driving them apart suddenly pulled them together. A desperate magnetic force. They were two broken things trying to make a whole. Clara stepped into him. Her arms went around his waist, holding him with a fierce grip, bunching the fabric of his shirt. Elias bowed his head, resting his forehead against hers. "I will not let them take you," he vowed into the silence. "I will burn this mountain down before I let them put chains on you. And I will not let you die for me," she whispered back. They stood there in the dark, swaying slightly, anchored by the heat of the other. It was a promise that felt like stepping off a cliff. Terrifying, inevitable, and the only thing that made sense. The tragedy struck 3 days later. It was a gray, sullen Tuesday when Sheriff Vance rode up the trail. He did not come alone. He had two deputies with him, men who looked uncomfortable in their saddles. Elias met them at the gate. Clara stood on the porch with a rifle just inside the doorframe. Vance looked sick. His face was sallow, his eyes bloodshot. He looked like a man who had swallowed poison and was waiting for it to work. Thorne, Vance nodded. Sheriff, we found a body. Vance did not look at Elias. He looked at the pommel of his saddle. Down in Dead Man's Gulch, below your South Ridge. Elias waited. It was young Jebediah, Vance said. His voice cracked. The Miller boy, the one who works the livery. Clara gasped from the porch. Jeb was a gentle soul, a boy of 18 with a crooked smile who had always been kind to them, slipping an extra apple to their mule, nodding respectfully when others spat. Accident? Elias asked, though he knew the answer. That is the official report, Vance said. He rubbed his jaw, fell from the high trail, neck broke. Jeb was part goat, Elias said. He would not fall, I know that, Vance snapped, then lowered his voice, looking over his shoulder at his deputies. I know that, Elias. But Holloway says the boy was looking for strayed cattle, says he must have been spooked or chased. Vance finally looked Elias in the eye. There is talk, Thorne. Talk that you do not like trespassers. Talk that maybe you mistook the boy for one of Calloway's men. I have not fired a shot in 2 weeks, Elias said. Holloway is pushing for a warrant, Vance said, for the poachers who went missing. And now for the boy. He is saying you are a public menace. He is gathering affidavits. He killed that boy, Elias said quietly, to frame me. I have no proof of that, Vance said wearily. I am holding him off, Elias, but I cannot hold him forever. If a judge signs that paper, I have to come for you. And I will not come with just 2 men. Vance turned his horse. Stay on the mountain, Thorne. For God's sake, do not give them a reason. He rode away. The silence he left behind was heavy with the ghost of a dead boy. He was 18, Clara said. Her voice was hollow. She was leaning against the doorframe. Tears streamed down her face. He was kind, and they killed him just to get to us. This ends now, Elias said. He turned toward the barn. Where are you going? Clara ran after him, grabbing his arm. To finish it. Holloway's in town. I can find him. No, Clara screamed. She threw her weight against him, spinning him around. That is what they want. You go down there, you kill Holloway, and then what? The deputies shoot you. The town hangs you. And Calloway takes the mine and the land and everything else. They killed a child, Clara, and they will kill you. She was shaking him. Do not give them your life, Elias. Do not give them your soul. If you go down there as a sniper, you prove them right. You prove you are the monster they say you are. Elias trembled. The rage was a physical pain, a blinding white light behind his eyes. He wanted to let the monster out. It would be so easy. Then what do we do? He roared. Wait for them to starve us out? Wait for them to shoot us from the trees? We fight, Clara said. Her eyes blazed. But we fight as people, not animals. We find the truth. We drag it into the light. The light came that night, but not the way she meant. It was 2 a.m. The wind had died down. The cabin was silent. Clara woke to a sound, a soft whoosh, like an intake of breath. Then the smell, sharp, chemical, coal oil, Elias. She rolled out of the bunk just as the orange glow flared against the window. Elias was already moving. He grabbed the water bucket from the stand, the back wall. They burst out the front door. The rear of the cabin was licking with flames. Someone had splashed kerosene on the logs and tossed a torch. The dry pine was catching fast. The fire climbing toward the roof. Get the blankets, Elias shouted. Wet them in the trough, Clara ran. She plunged the heavy wool blankets into the icy water of the mule trough, dragging them out heavy and sodden. She ran back to Elias. He was beating the flames with a shovel, trying to smother the base of the fire. Clara threw a wet blanket over the highest flame she could reach. The steam hissed violently, scalding the air. They fought for 10 minutes. It felt like hours. Smoke stung their eyes, choked them. The fire wanted to eat the cabin, wanted to consume their sanctuary, but the logs were thick and the night was damp. They smothered the fire before it could catch the roof shingles. Elias stood panting, his face smeared with soot. He held his rifle in one hand, scanning the darkness. The woods were silent. The arsonists were gone. They had lit the match and run, cowards in the dark. "Are you hurt?" Elias rasped. "No," Clara coughed. "You?" No. Elias walked to the blackened logs. He knelt down. The smell of kerosene was overpowering. "Look," he said. He pointed to the mud near the foundation. The ground was soft from the heat of the fire. There, baked into the mud, was a boot print. It was distinct. The heel had a metal horseshoe tap, but the tap was broken in a V shape. "I have seen that boot," Elias said slowly, "on the blacksmith's deputy. The one Holloway hired last week." Clara moved closer. She picked up something from the ground. It was a rag, still reeking of oil, but it was not a normal shop rag. It was a piece of fine velvet, scorched and ruined. Maroon. "This is curtain fabric," Clara said. "Heavy velvet. The saloon has curtains like that," Elias said. "Holloway's private booth. He did not even bother to use a generic rag," Clara said, her voice hard. "He used what was at hand, because he thinks we are already dead." Elias stood up. He looked at the charred wall of his home. He looked at the boot print. He looked at the velvet rag. "We have the proof," he said. "The boy, the fire, the threats. It is all one line." "Sheriff Vance will not look at this," Claire said. "He will say we set the fire ourselves. He will say the rag proves nothing." "Then we do not go to Vance," Elias said. "Who?" "I heard talk in the post office," Elias said, before Calloway stepped in. "The postmaster was talking about a federal marshal. Marshal Graves. He is in Silverton, presiding over a land dispute. He rides the circuit. Silverton is 2 days' ride," Claire said. "Over the high pass, he is a federal officer," Elias said. "He does not answer to Holloway. He does not care about Argent politics. If we bring him this evidence, if we bring him the survey stakes and the testimony about the boy, we have a case. We have to go to him," Clara said. "We cannot bring him here. If we leave the cabin, they might burn it down for real." "Let them burn it," Clara said. She looked at the blackened wood. "It is just wood, Elias. We are the home, as long as we are alive." Elias looked at her. In the moonlight, with soot on her cheek and the smell of smoke in her hair, she looked unbreakable. "We leave at dawn," Elias said. "We take the high trail. We avoid the town." "We are going to run?" Clara asked. "No," Elias said. He checked the load in his rifle. "We are going to flank them." They packed light, ammunition, jerky. The survey stake Elias had pulled from his land, the velvet rag wrapped in oilcloth, the sketch he had made of the boot print. As the sun crested the peaks, painting the snow in shades of violent pink and gold, they mounted the mules. Elias looked back at the cabin. It stood scarred but standing, a defiant smudge against the pristine white. "We will come back," he said. "We will come back with the law," Clara corrected. They turned the mules toward the north, toward the high, treacherous pass that led to Silverton. They were leaving the fence line. They were stepping out of the sanctuary and into the open. But as Elias watched Clara ride ahead of him, her back straight, her head high, he realized they were not running away. They were charging. Holloway had made a mistake. He had pushed them until they had nothing left to lose but each other. And for that, he was going to burn. The Grand Imperial Hotel in Silverton was a structure of red brick and arrogance, standing amidst the mining camps like a tombstone for the wilderness that had been cleared to build it. Inside a small third-floor room, the air was thick with the scent of lavender water and gun oil. The smells of two people trying to scrub the mountain off their skin before they faced the world. Clara stood before the mirror, smoothing the dark fabric of a dress she had purchased with Elias's silver. It was plain, charcoal gray, high-collared and severe. It was armor. "Tell it again," Elias said. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped between his knees. He looked uncomfortable in a suit, his broad shoulders straining the seams of the coat, his beard trimmed close but still carrying the gray warnings of his age. "I am Clara Valenzuela," she said to the glass. Her voice wavered, then hardened. "I worked in the household of Arthur Russell in Denver for 2 years. I was not dismissed. I fled." "Louder," Elias said softly. "The judge is old, and the men in the back row will want to hear you break." Clara turned to face him. I fled because Mr. Russell believed his wages bought more than my labor. When I refused him, he tried to take what he wanted. I struck him in self-defense. I took nothing but my own life. Elias nodded. Good. Keep your eyes on Marshall Graves. Do not look at Holloway. Do not look at Calloway. They will try to catch your eye, to make you feel small. Do not let them. And you? Clara asked. She walked over to him, her skirts rustling. You must not sound like the sniper, Elias. You must sound like the landowner. Elias looked at his hands, hands that had ended more lives than he could count. I will try, but I cannot lie about what I am. If I pretend to be a sheep, the wolf will laugh. Be a shepherd then, Clara whispered, touching his shoulder. Protect the flock, even if the flock is just us. The courtroom was packed. Miners, prospectors, curious wives. They filled the benches, sweating in the stuffy heat. When Elias and Clara entered, the noise died instantly. Leland Holloway sat at the plaintiff's table, looking bored. Boyd Calloway sat beside him, cleaning his nails, his smirk fixed in place like a scar. Marshall Graves sat behind the high bench. He was a federal man sent from Washington to bring order to the territories. He had a face like a dried apple and eyes that had seen every variation of human greed. This is an inquiry into the disappearance of 2 men on the Black Ridge claim, Graves announced. His voice was dry and caring. And a review of the allegations of criminal trespass and assault lodged by Mr. Elias Thorne. Let us be quick. The law has a long saddle and a tired horse. Holloway's lawyer, a slick man from Denver named Silas Reed, stood up. He painted a picture of Elias that was terrifying in its distortion. He spoke of a madman, a recluse who hoarded land he did not mine, a veteran whose mind had snapped, leading him to hunt men for sport. Then he turned to Clara, and his companion, Reed said, gesturing with a disdainful flick of his wrist. A woman of mixed blood and mixed morals, a fugitive from Denver, known for theft and violence. She hides behind his fence because no decent roof would shelter her. Is this the witness we are to trust against the word of a pillar of industry, like Mr. Holloway? The crowd murmured. Thief. Someone whispered loud enough to be heard. Harlot. Clara sat rigid, her spine not touching the back of her chair. Elias's hand rested on the table. A fist of iron. But he did not move. Call Clara Valenzuela, Marshall Graves said. Clara walked to the stand. She placed her hand on the Bible. She swore to tell the truth. Reed attacked immediately. Is it true you are wanted for grand larceny in Denver? It is true there is a warrant, Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear. But the charge is a lie. A lie? Reed laughed. Mr. Russell is a banker. You are a maid. You struck him and ran. Why run if you are innocent? Clara looked at the marshal. I ran because the law belongs to men like Mr. Russell. In his house, I was property. When I said no, he attacked me. I defended myself. If I had stayed, I would be in prison, or I would be dead. She paused. I stole nothing. My virtue was not his to take, and it was not his to buy. The room went silent. She did not cry. She did not beg. She stated the horror of her reality as a simple fact of geography and gender, and the crowd listened. Then it was Elias's turn. He sat in the chair, filling it completely. He did not fidget. You are a sharpshooter, Reed accused. A killer by trade. I was a soldier, Elias corrected. I did a job, and you still do it. You patrol that mountain with a buffalo gun. You threaten anyone who comes near. I patrol my land, Elias said. His voice was a low rumble, vibrating in the floorboards. I fenced the lower meadow. I posted signs. I warned those men. You admit you threatened them. I told them to leave, Elias said. If I wanted them dead, Mr. Reed, you would not be looking for missing persons. You would be looking for graves. A chill went through the room. It was not a threat. It was a technical assessment. The mountain is steep, Elias continued. The scree is loose. The cold kills in minutes. Those men were dressed for a saloon, not a squall. I did not shoot them. I did not trap them. I simply refused to be their mother. You are a cold man, Thorne, Reed sneered. I am a man who wants to be left alone, Elias said. But Mr. Holloway will not allow that. He wants the ore he thinks is under my cabin. He has sent men to cut my wire. He has sent men to survey my land. He paused. And he sent a boy to die, to make me look like a monster. Objection, Reed shouted. Speculation, I have the boot print, Elias roared, standing up. The sudden movement made half the room flinch. He pulled the sketch and the scorched velvet rag from his coat pocket. He slammed them onto the marshal's bench. From the night they tried to burn us out, a print with a broken horseshoe tap and a rag of maroon velvet. Marshal Graves picked up the rag. He looked at Holloway. This looks familiar, Leland. Matches the upholstery in your private booth at the Golden Nugget. Holloway stood up, his face red. This is preposterous. He planted it. Sit down. Graves banged his gavel. Is there anyone who can corroborate the events on the mountain? The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. I can. The man who hobbled in was leaning on a crutch. His right foot was heavily bandaged. He was missing 3 fingers on his left hand from frostbite. It was Thomas Ali. The stocky poacher, the survivor. The crowd parted for him. He looked like a specter, gaunt and angry. Name? Graves asked. Thomas Ali. The man rasped. He glared at Holloway. He stopped paying my medical bills last week. Said I was a loose end. Holloway's face drained of color. Calloway shifted in his seat, his hand drifting toward his coat. Tell us, Mr. Ali, Graves said, leaning forward. Why were you on the mountain? We was not hunting deer. Ali spat. We was hired, $5 a day, plus a bonus if we could provoke the hermit. Provoke him to what? To shoot, Ali said. Mr. Calloway gave us the wire cutters. He said cut the fence, shoot his stock, scare the girl, make him fire the first shot. Then the sheriff could go up there and hang him legal-like. The courtroom erupted. Sheriff Vance, who had been standing in the back, looked at the floor, shame burning his ears. And the boy? Graves asked. Jebediah Miller? Ali looked down. That was not us. That was Calloway alone. He said he needed a body to speed things up. Said an accident would look suspicious enough. Calloway jumped up. He is a liar, a drunk. Sit down, Boyd, Graves shouted. He pointed a long bony finger at the sheriff. Sheriff Vance, arrest that man. Vance hesitated for only a second. The shame of the last month, the weight of the dead boy, the pressure of Holloway's money. It all broke under the clarity of the truth. He drew his revolver. Boyd Calloway, Vance said, his voice steady. Put your hands up. Calloway looked at Holloway. The mine owner was staring straight ahead, refusing to meet his foreman's eyes. Holloway was cutting his losses. Calloway sneered. He raised his hand slowly. You are making a mistake, Vance. The mine owns this county. Not today, Vance said. He clamped the irons on Calloway's wrists. Marshal Graves looked at Holloway. And you, Leland, you are going to stay in town. I am issuing a federal subpoena for your financial records. If I find one payment to this man, he pointed at Ali, you will be breaking rocks in Yuma for the rest of your life. Holloway stood up, smoothing his expensive suit. He looked at Elias. There was no fear in his eyes, only a cold reptile hatred. This is not over, Thorne, Holloway whispered as he passed the defense table. Paper does not stop a bullet. The hotel room felt different that evening. The air was no longer thick with anxiety. It was charged with the electric trembling aftermath of survival. They had won. The words had been spoken. The truth was written in the court ledger. Clara stood by the window, watching the sun set over the peaks. She was shaking. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the testimony was crashing, leaving her knees weak. Elias came up behind her. He did not touch her at first. He just stood there, a solid wall of heat and presence. You were brave, he said. Clara turned. Her eyes were wide, dark pools. I was terrified. I thought they would laugh. They did not laugh, Elias said. They listened. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His hand lingered on her cheek, the rough calluses of his fingertips against her soft skin. We can go back, Elias said, to the mountain. It is ours again. Is it? Clara asked. She leaned into his hand, her eyes closing. Holloway is still free for now, Elias said. But tonight we are here. The restraint that had held them apart shattered. It did not break because of a decision. It broke because they had walked through the fire together and come out the other side alive. They needed to prove that aliveness to each other. Clara reached up and gripped the lapels of his coat. She pulled him down. Elias, she breathed. He kissed her. It was not like the desperate, angry collision in the cabin weeks before. This was slow, deep, a question and an answer all at once. He lifted her, carrying her to the bed. For Elias, touching her was an act of worship. He moved with a reverence that belied his size, terrifyingly gentle, as if he were handling something precious. For Clara, his weight was a grounding force. She did not feel trapped. She felt anchored. She felt his power, the coiled strength of his muscles, and knew that it was entirely devoted to shielding her. "I am here," she whispered in the dark, her hands tangled in his hair. "I am real. You are everything," Elias answered. In the quiet of that room with the town sleeping below them, they claimed each other. It was a reclaiming of territory, not land, but the self. They took back the parts of themselves that had been stolen by cruelty and shame, and gave them to each other. The morning brought a cold, hard light. They were eating breakfast in the hotel dining room when Sheriff Vance walked in. He looked tired. He had not slept. "You need to leave," Vance said, skipping the pleasantries. "Now." Elias put down his fork. "Why?" "Graves issued the orders. Graves is a judge." Vance leaned on the table. "Calloway writes in blood. I have Calloway in the cell. But Holloway cleaned out his safe at the bank this morning. He sent riders out to the mining camps." "To do what?" Clara asked. "To hire breakers," Vance said. "Hard men, strike breakers, gun thugs. He is telling them that the federal government is trying to shut down the mine. He is telling them that you, Elias, are the reason they are going to lose their jobs." Elias stood up. "He is going to the mountain. He is gathering a posse," Vance said. "Not a legal one, a lynch mob. He plans to go up there, burn the cabin, and claim you resisted. With Graves here, he has to make it look like a war, not a murder." "How many men?" Elias asked. 20, maybe 30. "We have to get back," Clara said. Standing up, "Our supplies, the ammunition, the high ground." "You should run south," Vance said. "Get out of the territory." "No," Elias said. His voice was like grinding stone. "I bought that land. I paid for it. I bled for it. And I will not run from a thief in a silk suit." "I cannot stop him," Vance said. "I have 2 deputies, and one of them is shaky. Graves is sending a telegram for marshals, but they are a week away." "Give us a head start," Elias said. "Hold them in town if you can." "I will try," Vance said. "But he moves at noon." They rode the mules hard. The animals were strong, mountain-bred, but the pace was punishing. They did not take the switchbacks. They took the goat trail, a terrifyingly steep path that cut hours off the journey, but risked a fall at every turn. Elias rode in front, his eyes scanning the ridges. Clara followed, her face set in a grim mask. They reached the lower meadow as the sun began to dip behind the peaks. The cabin was still there. The charred back wall was a black scar, but the roof held. "Get the animals in the barn," Elias ordered as they dismounted. "Bar the doors from the inside. Fill every bucket with water." Clara ran to the creek. She filled the buckets, her arms aching. She carried them inside, sloshing water onto the floor. Elias went to the heavy chest at the foot of his bunk. He unlocked it. Inside were boxes of 45-70 cartridges, heavy lead slugs that could punch through a tree. He laid them out on the table in neat rows. He took the Sharps rifle. He took the Winchester repeater. He took the shotgun. "Load everything," he said to Clara. She sat at the table, her fingers moving quickly, sliding the brass cartridges into the loading gates. "Click, click, click. They will come at dusk," Elias said, looking out the window. "They will try to use the failing light to cross the meadow. After dark, that slope is a broken ankle waiting to happen." 20 men, Clara said. "Can we hold them?" Elias looked at her. He walked over and took her face in his hands. "The mountain is a funnel," he said. "There is only one path up. They have to come single file until they reach the meadow. I can hold the path. And if they flank us, the scree slopes will stop them. Or the cliffs." He kissed her forehead. "I need you to watch the back. If anyone comes through the timber, you shoot. You do not warn them. You do not hesitate. I will not, she said. The sun dropped behind the peaks like a heavy gold coin slipping into a pocket. The twilight that followed was not the soft purple of summer, but the bruised slate gray of an approaching winter. Elias lay down on the porch, propping the heavy barrel of the sharps on a log. He adjusted the vernier sight, dialing in the range for the tree line at the edge of the meadow, 600 yards. He took a breath. In 2, 3, 4. Then he saw them, shadows detaching from the tree line. One, then another, then 3 more. They were not soldiers. They moved with the jerky, nervous energy of hired muscle who had been promised easy money and were suddenly realizing the job involved climbing a mountain into the teeth of a rifleman. Elias did not aim for a man. He aimed for a white granite boulder the size of a wagon wheel directly in the path of the lead rider. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, a thunderclap that slammed against the canyon walls. A split second later, the rock exploded. Stone shards sprayed the led horse, which reared violently, throwing its rider into the brush. The valley erupted in shouts. The men scrambled for cover. Warning shot, Elias muttered. Reloading. The metallic clack of the breech block was loud in the silence. They are spreading out, Clara called from the back window. 2 moving up the east flank, 3 on the west. Let them try the west, Elias said grimly. That is the slide area. The attack came as a siege. Holloway's men began to fire from the tree line, a ragged volley that spattered harmlessly against the thick logs. They were shooting at a ghost. Then bottles filled with kerosene began to arc through the air, trailing flames. Cover me, Elias shouted. He grabbed a bucket and charged out. He splashed the water on the burning steps. Steam hissed violently. A bullet struck the door frame inches from his head, sending a spray of splinters into his cheek. Elias dived back inside. They are closer. He rasped, 50 yards in the rocks. And then the snow came. It started as a flurry, then thickened instantly into a curtain. Visibility dropped to nothing. The shooting stopped. Under the wind came a different sound. Boots on the porch. They had used the whiteout to rush the cabin. The door shuddered under a heavy blow. Back, Elias roared. The door flew open, letting in a swirl of snow and 3 men. The first man held a revolver. Elias fired the Winchester from his hip. The man crumpled. The second man lunged, tackling Elias. They crashed into the table. Elias fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. The man was younger, stronger. He had his hands on Elias's throat, squeezing. From the corner came a deafening roar. The man on top of Elias jerked violently, then went limp. Clara stood by the stove, the shotgun smoking in her hands. She had fired over Elias's shoulder, the spread of buckshot catching the attacker in the side. The third man hesitated. He looked at his fallen comrades. He looked at the woman with the empty eyes and the smoking gun. He turned and ran. Then, a sound cut through the storm, a whistle, sharp, piercing, authoritative, then shouting. Drop it! Federal Marshal, drop the weapon or you die where you stand. Clara crawled to the window. Through the swirling snow, she saw shapes with lanterns moving up the path. Elias. She breathed. It is the law. The cavalry had arrived from the south. Holloway was in irons at the trailhead, watching through a spyglass as his empire crumbled. It was over. The aftermath was not a parade. It was a slow, painful extraction. Getting Elias down the mountain took 4 men and a stretcher. His leg was badly torn, 30 stitches, a drain, fever that came and went. Clara did not leave his side. She slept in the chair. She changed his dressings. She spoke to the marshal, giving her statement with a flat, exhausted precision that left no room for doubt. Holloway's empire collapsed quickly. The federal charges froze his assets. The mine closed for a week, then reopened under government receivership. The snake had been defanged. 2 weeks later, the doctor cleared Elias to travel. You will limp, the doctor said, snapping his bag shut. Maybe for a year, maybe forever. The cold will ache. I am used to aches, Elias said. They packed their few belongings. Where will you go? Vance asked them as they loaded the wagon. Home, Elias said. The cabin is a wreck, Vance said. Blood on the floor, door gone. It is a tomb up there. It is wood and stone, Clara said. We can scrub the floor. We can build a door. They drove the wagon out of town. The mud was freezing into ruts. They passed the church where the preacher stood on the steps. He watched them go. He did not quote scripture. He simply tipped his hat. A silent admission that perhaps judgment was not his alone to dispense. The mountain was silent when they returned. The snow had covered the scars of battle. The dead men had been hauled away. But the white boulder Elias had shattered still lay in fragments, a monument to the siege. The cabin was cold. The door was broken. Propped up with a lung, the floor was stained dark. Elias hobbled in on his crutch. He looked at the place where he had almost died. He looked at the place where Clara had killed a man to save him. He felt a wave of sickness, not from the pain, but from the memory. "We cannot stay here," he said quietly. "Too much blood." Clara set her bag on the table. She walked to the bucket, broke the ice, and dipped a rag. She got down on her knees and began to scrub the floor. "We are not leaving, Elias," she said. "Clara, the blood washes out," she said, scrubbing harder. "The wood forgets. We do not." She stopped and looked up at him. "If we leave, they win. If we leave, we are just running again. I am done running." Elias dropped his crutch. He lowered himself to the floor, wincing as his leg protested. He took the rag from her hand. "You missed a spot," he whispered. He began to scrub. They scrubbed together, shoulder to shoulder, cleaning the violence from their home until the water in the bucket was black and the wood was pale and clean. That night, they built a fire that roared in the hearth. They hung a blanket over the doorway until the repairs could be made. They lay in the narrow bunk, holding each other. "I was afraid," Elias admitted into the dark. "When I saw you with that gun, I thought I had turned you into me, into a killer." Clara rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You did not turn me into anything, Elias. You just showed me that I could protect what I loved. That is not violence. That is necessity." "I do not want to bite a sniper anymore," he said. "I do not want to look at the world through a scope." "Then don't," she said. "Look at it through a window. Look at it through a door." She traced the line of his jaw. "The path to Silverton is dangerous. People get lost. Women get trapped in storms. Men get hurt." "Yes, we have a barn," she said. "We have a roof. We know the mountain better than anyone." "A way station?" Elias asked. "A sanctuary," Clara corrected. "For people who are running, for people who are cold. We do not have to be the hermit and the outcast. We can be the keepers." Elias thought about it. He thought about the silence he had craved and how empty it had been. He thought about the noise of the world and how cruel it could be. And he thought about this middle ground, a place between the wild and the town, a place where the fire was always lit for those who deserved it. "I can build a larger table," he said. "And I can plant a larger garden," she replied. Spring came late to the San Juans. But when it arrived, it was glorious. The columbines exploded in blue and white across the meadow. The stream ran clear and loud. Elias stood by the fence. He had replaced the wire. It was tight, singing in the breeze. But it was no longer a barrier to keep the world out. It was a line that marked safety. He saw a rider coming up the trail, a lone traveler, weary, his horse stumbling. Elias did not reach for his rifle. He watched the man approach. Clara stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing a clean apron. Her hair was tied back with a blue ribbon. She looked at Elias. She smiled. "Coffee is on," she called out. Elias opened the gate. He stood there, leaning on his cane, his other hand open in greeting. "Welcome," Elias said to the stranger. "Step inside, the fire is warm." The traveler looked at the scarred man and the beautiful woman, at the sturdy cabin and the savage, indifferent peaks rising above them. He tipped his hat. "Much obliged." Elias closed the gate, but he left it unlatched. He walked back to the cabin, his limp barely noticeable now, walking toward the woman who had turned a fortress into a home. They had stopped running, they had planted their feet in the rock, and like the pines that clung to the high slopes, they had found a way to grow where nothing else could survive. The fence line was no longer a barrier. It was an invitation, and that made all the difference.